Top of the spring semester. It is my absolute delight to kick it off with Professor Jayesh Rathod, who is visiting us from American, but he's on leave right now and visiting at CUNY Law School. He comes with a bundle of wonderful credentials to speak on the subject that he's speaking about, having the asylum clinic, what's the name of the clinic? Immigration Law Clinic, director there, and having practice experience. And I must say that a number of our suggestions this semester come from faculty members who have suggested people find speakers. And Jenny first recommended him as a speaker, and I read his work and thought it was wonderful, and I'm sure you will as well. Jenny wanted to say a couple words about that.
I'm just thrilled he would join us, especially in a semester, whereas he told me he unwisely took on a visit where he's teaching a new course prep of admin law. So thank you particularly for coming during that. And, you know, Jayesh was one of my go-to people on all things scholarship. I knew he would come and give a good talk, and I'm really thrilled to have him here. And he was my next door neighbor.
And I would be remiss not to remind you that next week we have our second speaker, and that's Solange Maldonado, whose book called The Architecture of Desire has been making waves and raising a lot of interesting questions on themes that are not unrelated to his themes. Her work is related to discrimination law. She's also a reporter for the Family Law Project. So without further ado, what?
Do you want me to turn off this row? Or you're going to use it?
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. And we're also lucky today to have Lauris Wren, who directs our own clinic here in Asylum and works with the LGBT plus program. And also Alexander Holtzman, who is down with the flu, but has nevertheless agreed. He's gonna sort of power through it and provide some responses. So our usual, for those of you who are new to the workshop, our usual practice is to have the speaker speak for a period of time, usually 15, 20 minutes, and then to hear reactions or a reaction from one of our colleagues, and then to open the floor for conversation and discussion, and I will keep it cute. And I see several people whose names I'm not familiar with, so you'll please, I'll just say the person in the white cable knit sweater. Here we go.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for that introduction, for the introductions. It's really great to be here and to be at Hofstra. I was telling Dean Roberts I was last here, I think maybe 15 years ago for a conference. So it's nice to be back at a place where there's so many faculty that I admire, and of course, Dean Roberts, who I respect and adore so much. So thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to be presenting this work in progress to all of you. As you know, it's entitled Transitional Citizenship. And this is a paper that examines how transgender US citizens understand and negotiate their relationship with the US citizenship, even as conditions of hostility and marginalization are pushing them to depart the country. Now, before I dive into the paper, I want to say a word about the broader scholarly project that I've been pursuing for the last 5 years. Even as my clinic students and I have been working to help people who are arriving in the United States or wishing to remain in the United States, as a scholar, I've been focusing on the opposite, migratory outflows from the United States. So my prior work in this series includes a piece on US citizen asylum seekers, a companion conceptual piece entitled Pressured Exit, which focuses on compelled migration from the United States, and an autoethnographic essay that I wrote entitled Exiting the American Dream, about my own experience as a gay man of color and the son of immigrants pursuing exit planning. So as you can tell, I have a very uplifting research agenda. But in all seriousness, the broader project that I'm pursuing tackles some very timely and profoundly important questions, including these. Can we say that the United States today is producing forced migrants? In the migration studies literature, there's this divide between voluntary and forced migration, and many challenge that dichotomy, but we rarely think of the United States as a source country for forced migrants. I'm interested in unpacking that question. Also, how do we categorize this phenomenon, right? Within the existing social, scientific, and legal literature, what do we call this? And as US citizens plan and enact departure, what are the implications for US citizenship? And of course, it's this last question that's the focus of my work in progress today. Now, I conceived of this study back in 2023. And at the time, like many of us, I began to note a rise in anti-trans rhetoric and legislation, especially at the state and local levels, right? There were conversations percolating among members of the transgender community about moving domestically from one state to another. And some were contemplating relocation overseas, but not as many. But of course, in the lead up to the 2024 presidential election, as we all know, the transgender community was indeed the focus of an extraordinary level of public attention, right? Tens of millions of dollars in campaign ads targeting that community. And beyond that level of hostility in media and in society, trans folks have faced restrictions on access to gender-affirming care, as we know, rampant discrimination in the workplace, elevated levels of violent victimization, and even through the present, we know that the political targeting of the trans community persists, right? For example, in Virginia, we had a recent governor's race just a couple of months ago. 57% of the ad spending by the Republican candidate and the candidate's supporters was on anti-trans ads. And so to put that in perspective, more than half of all the political spending on one side of the election was directed at a community that comprised less than 1% of the population. So it's an unmistakably hostile social climate, and it makes sense that trans folks might be thinking about internal migration as well as a permanent overseas move. And in my interviews, which I'll talk more about, these dynamics played out. And I'll just give you a few quick examples. Robin, who's a transgender woman living in the central United States, described being attacked violently in a public restroom. And concern about safety was one of the many reasons that led her to move to Europe. Julia, who's another transgender woman who I interviewed, relocated with her family to Canada because in part she was terrified of the prospect of losing access to estrogen. And Ray, who identifies as binary, non-binary, somebody who I spoke to, Ray had attended countless job interviews. And every time Ray went into the job interview, for a position that Ray was eminently qualified for, all of a sudden the interviewers would get flustered and then Ray wouldn't get the job. These experiences, of course, these are just a couple anecdotes, but they shape one's sense of connection to and belonging to civil society. And they also animate the core research question that underlies my study, which is how do transgender individuals make sense of and navigate the relationship to citizenship when social and political hostility push them to plan for or pursue departure from the United States? Now, before I get into my methods and my findings, let me just situate the study within the existing literature, specifically on theories of citizenship. And much of the literature on citizenship centers on inclusion, how migrants gain entry into the polity, and how rights attach as a consequence. And there are several established frameworks for understanding citizenship, including a liberal framework, right? Focused on rights and equality, starting with the work of Locke in more recent times, authors like T.H. Marshall and Will Kimlicka. There's also a Republican framework, which is focused on civic virtue and participation. Scholars like Rousseau, right, back in the day, bringing one of the key thinkers. Humanitarian models, which focus on shared values and shared goals, as well as several critical strands. Right? There is, of course, second-class citizenship, which as legal scholars we're very familiar with, cosmopolitan approaches, post-colonial approaches, sexual citizenship, right? Theories of citizenship have also examined how states deploy emotions, right, to bind the polity, the type of affective citizenship. There's also instrumental considerations, right? So there's quite a number of strands in the literature. And just for the record, these aren't even all of the strands of citizenship. And there is a body of work that focuses on citizenship in the context of emigration, in the context of departure. But these have mostly focused on structural or policy dimensions of the relationship between citizens and their countries of origin. For example, there's work on diasporic governance, or Kim Berry's writings on the state-diaspora relations, right? Various other authors have written about transnational citizenship, right? The idea that individuals age can maintain ties to more than one country at a time. These works do confirm that citizenship can persist across borders, but they give less attention to how citizenship is understood and the meaning that citizenship holds for immigrants. And so in many ways, the literature largely overlooks how people understand their rights as citizens, their responsibilities, and their identity as citizens when the foundations of the membership in the state begin to erode and they find themselves on the threshold of exit. So to explore this issue, I obtained IRP approval and I conducted 40 in-depth interviews with transgender citizens who had either emigrated or who were preparing to do so. And the interviewees were ranging in age from 24 to 62. They lived or had lived in different parts of the country, had diverse forms of gender expression, and had various destination countries in mind. And I'm happy to talk more about the interview sample if folks are interested. And also I'm happy to talk more about methods, but let me just say that participant recruitment was a challenge for this study. And you can imagine why, precisely because of the extreme hostility, right, that the trans community has been facing. There was heightened concern about who I was, right? Was I in fact a legitimate scholar, or was I a subversive who was trying to get information about the trans community and use that to harm them? But nevertheless, I'm grateful I was able to complete a substantial number of interviews and reach a point of saturation in the data. And I coded the data and analyzed the data using both inductive and deductive approaches with the in vivo platform. All right, so let me get to the good stuff, which is let me tell you what I found in the data. And let me first actually disclose what my initial hypothesis was. So I suspected that most of the transgender citizens would describe some kind of rupture with the state. It makes sense, right? I hypothesized that these trans citizens would focus on liberal or second-class models of citizenship, right? Given the context of declining rights in the United States. You know, it makes sense. As a clinician, as an attorney, you focus on rights-based advocacy. It made perfect sense that this liberal model would be how people would articulate their relationship to citizenship. Well, it turns out that I was only partially right. Maybe more accurately, I was mostly wrong in my hypothesis. Maybe they didn't read my hypothesis when they did this interview, something like that. But the way that they described their relationship to citizenship among these participants was extremely diverse, right? But among all these various modes of citizenship that are captured here, 5 of them rose to the surface in the interviews. And it's these 5 that are left here on the slide. Some adopted a communitarian view, emphasizing citizenship as a bond of shared goals and values. Others did in fact talk about second-class citizenship, how they felt their rights were being taken away and that they felt no longer protected. Others articulated what I refer to as a cosmopolitan or post-colonial view of citizenship, noting how their view of U.S. citizenship shifts when they compare it to that of other countries. Others talk about instrumental citizenship, using citizenship as something that provides mobility and security, right? Even when they don't have an emotional connection to the state. And some actually interestingly talked about accident of birth. Just arbitrary that they happen to be born in the United States. Let me give you a couple of examples from my interview. So Owen, who's a trans man who'd been living in Texas, did articulate a type of second-class citizenship. So Owen said, I used to think that being a US citizen meant that the laws would protect me. That if something went wrong, I could go to a court and be protected at least somewhere in this country, right? And then Owen goes on to say, it feels like I don't count anymore. Or if bad things happen to me, it won't even make big news. It's like we are an underclass here and we don't have the same protections of the law. So very classic articulation of second-class citizenship. Now, Luna, who identifies as trans femme, articulated a type of cosmopolitan citizenship rooted in the comparison of the US and other countries. So what she said, if I'm honest, US citizenship just means a lot of embarrassment and shame when in regard to the larger global community. I'd rather not have to say I'm from the US. I'd rather claim citizenship in a lot of other places. And I love this part of the quote. Look at the other countries who you think you're on par with, and yet you're still the embarrassing, cousin at the party. So yeah, I don't feel like I'm afforded additional healthcare or social economic privileges that other countries on par with us have. Many articulated this, right? Comparing the United States and the rights that attach to citizenship with those that are afforded in other countries. Now, Leo, a trans man, spoke about citizenship in instrumental terms. I feel disillusioned and unaligned with American values, and yet I know how much power and privilege being an American citizen has. Now, Leo, who happens to be a trans man of color, says, I just keep my passport on me as a type of self-defense or a type of protection. So that's the work that citizenship is doing for Leo. It's more instrumental. And then we have Ray, who I mentioned earlier, the non-binary individual who had struggled at job interviews, spoke of accident at birth. I'm here because of accident at birth. I mean, I'm not proud to be an American. I'm not ashamed to be an American. It's just something I don't really reflect upon. To me, it's just a thing. It's just something I basically take for granted. Now, again, these findings were consistent with established theories of citizenship, and my empirical data confirmed the salience of these categories, right? As we can see in these quotes. But as I dug deeper into the data and looked at the transcript more closely, I began to notice some limits of these categories. First, many of the participants moved across various categories within a single interview. And beyond that, I could see that something else was going on in terms of how these individuals understood citizenship. They were recasting citizenship in their own terms. Their views were changing over time, and they were also views that defied simple emotional categorization. And those contradictions pushed me to rethink how citizenship functions under conditions of state and societal hostility. And that led me to develop this concept of transitional citizenship, which, as it says here, describes how individuals reassess and reshape their ties to the state when conditions of hostility and marginalization compel withdrawal. Now, I use this term to describe what's listed here, but also to make the point that this is not a fixed legal category. It's a dynamic, ongoing process. We can think of it as a type of civic in-betweenness, right? A state of civic in-betweenness where citizenship persists formally, right? But its meaning is being actively reworked and recalibrated. And as I began to refine this concept and give words to the patterns that were emerging in the data, I sensed that they might be connected to the queer experience or the queer gaze. And so I turned to queer theory to help me deepen and refine this concept of transitional citizenship. So I'm going to, as I move toward the end of this presentation, I just want to unpack some of the dimensions of transitional citizenship, and then I'll conclude. And so my data indicates that transitional citizenship unfolds across three dynamics: strategic and selective engagement with citizenship, temporal distancing and reassessment, and emotional complexity. And I'll address each of these briefly. First, strategic and selective engagement with citizenship. Now, the people I spoke with described citizenship in various ways, but they also engaged with citizenship strategically rather than as a fixed identity. Many of them used their passports instrumentally as a tool to move across borders, to create safety, or to plan an exit. Others rescaled the idea of citizenship, for example, shifting the focus away from the nation to more localized communities of belonging. I interviewed an individual named Wren, who lives here in the New York City area. They described themselves as a New York American. Nico, who lives in the Mid-Atlantic, described their community of membership as queer Appalachia instead of the United States. And also, a lot of the interviewees were using core civic ideals, but upending them and using them as forms of critique, pointing out how the principles were promised, but not delivered. In other words, they drew on the language of American citizenship to highlight its gaps and contradictions. Now, one useful way to understand this strategic use of citizenship is through the concept of disidentification, which was articulated by a queer theorist, José Esteban Munoz. And the concept of disidentification explains how marginalized people navigate and resist dominant norms by operating in a mode that is neither full assimilation nor full rejection. And so he uses the term disidentification to describe in his original work how queer artists of color work, quote, within and against, unquote, dominant frameworks simultaneously as a type of survival strategy. Now, a good example of disidentification is this painting by Amy Sherrill. Has anyone seen this painting before? It was in the New Yorker, right? It has been the center of some amount of controversy because Amy Sherrill, who is the artist who painted Michelle Obama's official portrait, was supposed to have an exhibit at the National Gallery of Art. And this painting, specifically, there was concern that it would be censored. So she moved her whole show from the National Gallery of Art in DC to Baltimore's Museum of Art. Now here, the model, a trans woman of color, is obviously inhabiting a dominant cultural frame, the Statue of Liberty, right? While simultaneously critiquing and reworking. And the selective and strategic uses of citizenship that I described a moment ago mirror the creative strategies that artists like this one and also Munoz described. The people that I spoke with didn't simply embrace citizenship as an identity or reject it outright. Instead, they engaged with it as a flexible set of practices, reflective, again, a form of disidentification with US citizenship, a way of navigating its structures without succumbing to its demand for conformity. Now, a second dynamic, temporal reassessment. Participants talked about taking a step back from US citizenship and seeing it differently once they had some distance, whether it was temporal, geographic, or both. For those who were still in the United States, the hostility around them led them to crave a type of pause, a moment to reflect on their citizenship to the country and what it still meant to them. So Matt, a trans man, offered the following poignant observation, and he compares his relationship to the United States with a familiar relationship. And he says, at this time, I think of my relationship with the US, it's going to have to be a surface relationship. And maybe it's just best for us to just kind of hover around each other. We all have family members with that kind of relationship, right? We kind of manage it. And I'm giving the US some space to figure out who they want to be. Me too, right? Many of us are doing that. What this quote doesn't capture is that the distancing that Matt was talking about wasn't just temporal, but also physical and geographic. At the time I conducted the interview, Matt was literally in his car, packed up, driving to Canada. Now, for people who already left the United States, the temporal distance played out in different ways. Some said that leaving the US, of course, deepened their disillusionment. It's so much better here in X country. But for others, that distance softened their feelings and gave them room to see the US with more complexity. And here's just one small taste of that. One of my interviews saying, the longer I live in Europe, maybe America is not actually the great Satan, right? So in these cases, whether slowing down, gaining distance, it helped participants rethink what citizenship meant to them and whether it still fit in the lives that they were trying to build. Now, finally, emotional complexity. The participants I spoke with described deep emotional complexity in how they related to their US citizenship. Many spoke of loving the communities and the histories that shaped them while feeling betrayed and endangered by the country. For example, one of my interviewees said, I'm embarrassed telling people I'm American. At the same time, same interview, would I defend the United States? Yes. Another saying, the United States is so commercialized and so focused on so many of the wrong things with it. I love America. I wouldn't necessarily think that there's a country that's greater than us. Others were a little flatter. I would never do anything to harm the United States with, I feel no sense of responsibility to help it either. Now, these quotes reflect what queer theorists and other theorists refer to as a type of affective ambivalence, right? The idea that marginalized people often hold conflicting emotions toward the institutions and forces that shape their lives, because those institutions provide resources, but also can be the source of harm. Scholars like Sarah Ahmed, Lauren Berlant have shown how attachment and rejection frequently sit side by side, right? I'm sure many of us can relate to this. People frequently long for things that they know that can hurt them, right? In my case, deep dish pizza, right? I'm from Chicago. Any other Chicagoans in the room? All right. So you know what I'm talking about. Yes, okay. You could mourn something that you've chosen to leave, or in the case of US citizenship, feel connected to a place that you no longer trust. And so their narratives reflected exactly this kind of ambivalence. Even when they felt anger or fear to the United States, they could still describe moments of feeling or belonging. And they illustrate how citizenship is not only a legal status, but also an affective terrain, right? Full of conflicting pulls and attachments that can't be resolved. So together, these dynamics show how citizenship operates under conditions of hostility, and that it's a practice of continual recalibration. It's not simply maintained or lost, but it's reworked, partially withdrawn, and even temporarily renewed. So to conclude, what is this project doing? Number one, it expands how theorists understand citizenship in the context of departure, which is an area of citizenship that is understudied. Second, it provides this empirical account of trans emigration as a site where citizenship is being redefined. And third, it introduces this concept of citizenship to describe this process of recalibration under conditions of hostility and marginalization. Now, beyond this, my findings also do help illuminate debates regarding the affirmative duties of states, approaches to administrative discretion, and even constitutional rights. I'm happy to talk about those in your Q&A. But above all, where I think this project adds value is that it gives life, of course, to these narratives, right, of community members, but it's also shining light on these conditions that are leading our fellow citizens to feel so distraught that they feel compelled to disengage from the nation. And while these numbers may be small now, if they do grow, it has an existential implication for US citizenship. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. As a first responder or reactor, I don't know, responder might be the wrong term. Let's call on Lauris Wren, our, everybody knows her, I hope. Lauris directs she's the attorney in charge of the Political Asylum Clinic and has a lot of other experience. Go ahead.
Thanks, and thank you so much for being here, and also for the paper, which was super thought-provoking and was meaningful on a whole bunch of different levels. I think running an asylum clinic and thinking about departure or possibly forced departure is particularly thought-provoking. One of the first thoughts I had, which I wondered about, and so would love to hear about, just certain factors of intersectionality. So it seems to me that for people who are choosing to leave and to restart a life in another country, in the vast majority of the situation, you're talking about higher socioeconomic classes. And I guess I would have loved to see in the paper some focus. You do mention that some in terms of the modality of your study, but to think, without a doubt, and there's a lot of writing on it, of course, socioeconomic class and views of citizenship are very interconnected. And so I wondered about the socioeconomic class of the people that you talk to, and also to the extent that a reader is thinking of this as a perception of trans people's perception of citizenship, how that is different if you include a wider variety. And then somewhat similarly, it is much easier to resettle, to move and to resettle in another country if you come from a family of immigrants, because that may give you a way. And actually, let me go back to, if you're a professional, it's much easier to find a job or maybe even have a path to citizenship to another country, which is another thing that ties it to socioeconomic. But children of immigrants, I have no such connections, and I'm reduced to looking at, Portugal and Malta as places that you can get citizenship even if you don't have that connection. But for most people, I think it's you have a parent or grandparent who are a citizen of another country, and so that gives you a path to get in. And of course, there's a lot of scholarship on how children of immigrants or people from immigrant families, what their views on citizenship are, and the fact of having a kind of dual background, how that influences. And so I wondered about the overlap with your subjects, how many were people from immigrant families, and whether that changed their views some. And I think those of us here who run clinics, who are several of us, probably had somewhat of the same reaction also as reading that, my clinic, we have a third of our spots, or at least a third, are LGBTQ plus cases.
Right.
So, and most of those clients are transgender.
Right.
So to be spending most of my day working with the students to fight for them to gain status in the United States so that they can gain protection, and they view the United States as a haven for transgender people and a chance for them to live in freedom. As through personal experience and through reading your article, I know people who are in fact leaving for the very the same ideas flipped over. It made me think about a few things, one of which is related to your article, and one which is not, but I'll throw that one out first anyhow because it's quick. Just that our humanitarian immigration law has often been contradictory. It is, consistently contradictory to what is going on in the country. So, and particularly with regard to the LGBTQ plus community, so that, we right now, there's a determined effort to, and the existence of trans people in many areas in the US, but at the same time, we are welcoming trans people and giving them protection here from dangers they face abroad. And that's what we've done historically. HIV was an inadmissibility ground. And at the same time as we were blocking people from entering the United States if they were HIV positive, we were granting people asylum for being HIV positive.
Right.
So that's just always an interesting thing to me. But the other thing I was thinking about is actually more in line with your past writing than was this one, although I do think it connects very much, which is when is walking away from citizenship, when is leaving, when is it a choice as compared to when is it forced exclusion? And with our trans clients coming from other countries, usually if they have a family member involved, which makes it necessary, we argue that it wasn't a choice, that they were forced out of their country, and that is an act of persecution against our clients. And I think you rightfully, in your current, the people that you're interviewing are describing it in vocabulary of choice, which I think at this point, there is choice involved without a doubt. And I also recognize that it's problematic to take agency away from targeted communities, but that if there is a point where your country is trying to eliminate population, that at that point, the language of forced exclusion, I think, is more accurate language than language of choice. And I don't know that we're there yet, but a lot of what is going on is the language that puts that into action.
Right.
But thank you, super interesting to read, and I have a million other thoughts of it that I may hit you up
I
with
think
some other
I'd love
times.
to, yeah.
Jayesh, do you want to respond?
I'd love to.
Hear from
Yeah,
Alex.
thank you, Lauris. That's so thoughtful, and the comments are really rich and thought-provoking. I'll just say a word or two about each. So, the point of intersectionality is a really important one. It's certainly one that I'm very conscious of, and I flag it in my methods sections, but it doesn't come out as much as it could in my analysis section. And you're right. So I noticed a number of things about my respondents. Number one, overwhelmingly white. And we know that the trans community is diverse, and the most vulnerable trans folks are trans people of color, trans women of color specifically. And I had very few of my research participants who fell into that category. Now, that may be because of their own structural vulnerability. They're not able to even think about getting out of the country and emigrating, right? Or it may be because of their fears and concerns about retaliation or confidentiality that they may not want to come forward. So it definitely isn't, it is what it is in terms of my data. It's a limitation. But I agree with you that it's important to look at this through an intersectional lens. So race is one that I certainly am attentive to, and class as well. I think you're right. I can give that more attention. I did get a rough sense of the class position of all my research participants, and interestingly, it was quite varied. What I found is that, the ability to move, of course, correlates with class, but then there's a lot of informal social networks that are starting to emerge in the trans community that are helping people move even in the absence of significant resources. There's folks who talk about, the creation of an underground railroad kind of thing for the trans community. And of course, class privilege still factors in, but there are a number of nonprofits and other networks that are emerging to help folks get out even in the absence of significant financial resources. And you're right about what are the pathways people are taking? The trans community is extremely well educated about what is going to work for them. So although I had come into this study with an interest in asylum seeking, very few of them are actually going abroad and seeking asylum because they know, at least right now, to your last point, it's not going to work. And many of them are pursuing work-related pathways. Others are, as you suggested, pursuing pathways of diasporic migration. My grandfather was Italian or Irish or whatever, so they're doing that. But also a number are just working the visa systems that exist. So Mexico has a fairly accessible permanent resident visa, just for the record, if anyone's trying to come up with your plan. A number of countries have passive income visas. So some of the older participants I spoke with, if they're getting a social security payment, that alone will be enough to give you a long-term visa in many countries. So many were pursuing those. So they're looking at all different kinds of visa pathways. I'll just say about the last point, are we at the point where this is a choice or no longer a choice and now it's compelled? I think we're inching towards that. I'm working on a work in progress with a political scientist where we're looking at adjudication of asylum claims by US citizens in other countries. And interestingly, in Canada, a handful of adjudicators have approved asylum petitions filed by trans US citizens. But then what's happening is that once it gets to the Court of Appeals, they're getting overturned. And the reason is, as you know, as an asylum expert, they're saying, you can predict what they're saying, right? You can move to another part of the US that's safer. You don't have to live in Nebraska, move to New York. And they're saying the rule of law in the United States is sufficiently strong that we can't say that it's unsafe. So they're kind of defaulting to these standard narratives about the rule of law in the United States and the integrity of US democracy and the legal system, which I think it's fair to say needs to be examined, right? And so that's what I'm looking at. But you're right. I think we're at an inflection point around that.
Thank you. Before I ask Alex to begin, please show your hands, and on screen, if you show your hands through the reaction image on the taskbar. And now Alex, who leads the Deportation Defense Clinic at Hofstra.
Sure. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I really enjoyed reading the piece. I wanted to start with a couple observations and end with a question. One observation I had, which it sounds like many of the clinicians share, is often naturalizing for our clients is kind of the end post, is the goal that we're shooting for our immigrant clients. Usually it's just getting a green card, but naturalization provides additional protections. And so I found your paper intellectually stimulating and a little cognitive dissonance. As I was reading it, thinking like, oh gosh, I haven't thought so much about the drawbacks of citizenship. And we encourage our clients to naturalize if they want to, for the legal protections it often provides. Similarly, a couple other points that just resonated with me, just to start there, is, my mom's also an immigrant. I noticed that Lauris and some of this discussion touched on that. And even now she's, texting me pictures of her naturalization certificate and passport when she travels, even domestically, out of fear of being, stopped and having issues. And it got me thinking about this duality that Lauris talked about of, during the same decade in the 1800s that Emma Lazarus wrote her famous poem, which you referred to, inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. The United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Basically saying, give us, you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, but not the Chinese, right? And so these prejudices, the hostility and marginalization that you refer to, I think have been with us as a country, ever since the founding. And it got me thinking, to get to my question of how and whether the transitional citizenship framework applies beyond, the individuals you surveyed, beyond even the trans community. And if you think it applies to other marginalized groups, I wonder, do you think there's a hostility that's required towards self? Or do you think even a hostility towards values would encompass some of what your framework describes? And so I was thinking of individuals like Muhammad Ali, for example, right, who were subject to the draft, or even you might say someone who's not subject to the draft, but who's a pacifist, who decides, the values that my country is exhibiting by invading, a foreign nation in this context are not something that I support, and what that means, for their conception of citizenship. So I guess I was curious if you intend, and maybe I'm really asking a question about your next article, but if you think this framework could apply even more broadly is a question that I had reading your piece.
Great. Shall I respond?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So thank you for that, Alex. And just, to the point that both you and Lauris had made about, there's this interesting juxtaposition of us working so diligently to get people into the United States for the same reason that people are leaving. I'm not sure what to make of that myself either, other than, I guess relative to other countries, it may be safer here in the United States. But I do have a fear, and I don't want to speak into existence, that some of the kind of all the hostility is going to, at some point, like the wall is going to break, right? It's going to spill over into the adjudication of asylum claims. So
I think we all heard the rumor that asylum officers weren't going to be able to allowed to use the word transgender.
Right.
In there, which I don't know. We've had transgender cases in court, but not in the asylum office. But we've gotten our work permits approved in the correct gender. So maybe not, but definitely we were all afraid of that. Yeah.
So that's an interesting, like a policy question of whether the immigration authorities are going to somehow import all of these unpleasant norms that they're trying to impose on society into the immigration adjudication system. Not yet, but it may be coming. But Alex, to your question, absolutely. I think it's possible, in fact, probable, that this frame or this concept that I was able to discern with the transgender community could apply to other communities. So, this is what I enjoy so much about qualitative empirical work, right? It's not designed to be, first of all, it's not designed to be representative of all transgender, right? I acknowledge that and recognize that because it's only 40 people that I know. And second of all, the point is to develop a set of grounded theoretical principles, which you can then test out and apply to other communities and other populations through both qualitative and potentially some kind of quantitative work, right? As I was writing up this paper, I kept asking myself, Alex, am I experiencing transitional citizenship myself? Like, I feel different emotions about the country. I think that I could identify with some, but not all of the dimensions of transitional citizenship. I think a lot about the Black American experience, right? So, and to be clear, that this is not a new, like the idea of leaving the United States because you feel forced out is not a new phenomenon, right? Although we're seeing it more predominantly with the trans community and other communities, but let's go back to like James Baldwin, right? And Black intellectuals and others who left the country because they felt unwelcome here and unsafe. And there too, of course, they had a fair amount of privilege, but the whole like back to Africa, another like double consciousness. There's a lot of resonance with like, Black intellectual thought. So I do think that these principles could be extended to other marginalized communities. And when I presented this paper before, a question that I've gotten as well, like couldn't this just be like a feature of citizenship generally, right? That everyone has some amount of recalibration that you do with citizenship, perhaps. But I would argue that the particular aspects of transitional citizenship that I documented, let's see if those apply to all communities. The level of hostility that the trans community is facing, I think, has led to a particular set of practices around citizenship. But it is totally plausible that they might extend to other communities.